Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilt, and I'm so excited to be sharing another fun tutorial with you. I'm going to show you how to make my herringbone quilt shown behind me. This is made from my Stitchy fabric, and it's actually a free pattern that you can download. Now with this quilt, I wanted to really go in depth and show you how I made the entire quilt from start to finish. Now in this video, I'm actually showing how I cut it all out with the AccuQuilt die cutting system. But the pattern actually gives instructions for both methods, die cutting and regular rotor cutting. So no matter what you want to do, you can follow along and binding. My goal is to help you enjoy quilting and feel confident in making the entire quilt from start to finish. So let's dive in. Choose colorful fabric that has good contrast between light and dark. I like to pre-wash anything that's a fat quarter or larger. I'll throw in several color catchers to the wash and then tumble dry. It's a bit of a mess when I'm done, but then I'm ready for the next step, which is starching. I'm using a hot dry iron with no steam and inexpensive grocery store starch. The brand that I like is called Faultless Premium Starch with the gold lid. I'm going to starch and press both sides of the fabric. So I'll lay out one piece on top of a big board that sits on top of my regular ironing board. I'll spray the wrong side first and then flip it over to the front side. This allows the starch to penetrate the fabric and not flake off on the iron. Then I'll press the side that has not been starched. Next, I'll starch the side that I just pressed, then flip it over to the back side again and press from that side with my hot dry iron. This will stiffen up the fabric a little bit, making it easier to cut and sew and minimize the stretching, especially on the bias edges of the half square triangles that I'm going to make. Once I'm done pressing, I'll lift up the fabric by the selvages and shake it out so that it hangs straight. If the fabric looks a little bit off kilter, I can walk it back and forth with my fingers until it hangs straight. I also like to fold it in half again so that I'm cutting through 4 layers at once. I'll starch and press my fat quarters the same way. Because they are smaller, I can prep 2 of them at the same time on my board. I'll spray one side first, then flip and press, keeping track of which fat quarter I touch first so it has time for the starch to penetrate the fabric. Then I'll repeat this again. Starch one side of both fat quarters, flip them over, and then press again from the other side. I'll repeat this for all of the fabrics I'm going to cut. Be sure to follow the free pattern instructions so you know how many strips to cut before cutting them up into triangles or into squares if you're going to make it the traditional way. I'm going to use the AccuQuilt Go Big Electric Cutter, but the pattern includes instructions to use traditional cutting methods too. My strips are cut a little oversized, and I'm using the 5-inch finished half square triangle die. I'm fan folding my strips so that I can cut through as many layers as possible. With the fat quarter strips, I can get 3 cuts out of them, and each cut is 2 triangles. So that's 6 triangles per strip, and each strip is about 21 inches long. There's something very satisfying about sending these babies through the machine and getting perfectly cut triangles each time. I'm just fan folding 1 strip at a time, but I could layer them together and cut through 2 strips if I wanted to. The AccuQuilt machine can easily cut through 6 layers of quilting cotton, which is really nice. Now I'm cutting through a full-size strip, or about 42 inches long. This is from the background fabric. So it's going to cut through 6 layers this time, and I'll get 12 triangles from each background fabric strip. Now I'll show you how I cut through 2 of the fat quarter strips at a time, since 2 of those are basically the same size as one full-length strip. I'll just keep cutting until my strips are done. Just keep cutting, just keep cutting. I love seeing that strip pile diminish, don't you? Now I'm going to show you how I cut my binding strips from the leftovers. I'm using the 2-inch strip cutter, and I'm only lining up the fabrics along one of the blades because I only need 1 strip per fabric for the binding. You can cut your binding wider, or you can cut out more strips if you wanted to from one fabric, but I really like the scrappy look. Now I've stacked my triangles in order next to my machine for easy access. Here's a bonus tip. Use up leftover bobbins, especially if they're cotton, when you are piecing a colorful scrappy quilt. I'm starting with a scrap of fabric called a leader. This will catch my threads so that they don't bunch up right at the beginning. Notice how I'm lining up the blunted ends. Now, if you're doing this with traditional rotary cutting, you're going to cut squares and then sew them together and then cut them apart later, so make sure you check that out in the pattern. Right now, I'm sewing with an accurate 1/4 inch seam, and I'm using a stiletto to guide my pieces through the machine. My Bernina is a 770 QE, and it has a dual feed system that acts sort of like a walking foot, so I'm keeping that engaged and using the 37D foot, which is the 1/4 inch dual feed foot. I'm using the straight stitch sewing plate, and I've lowered my stitch length to 2.0. This makes for a tighter seam, which won't come apart when I press my seams open a little bit later. It also helps that you don't see any of the thread poking through the seams. The only downside of sewing with a shorter stitch length is that it's harder to do the frog stitch. You know that one, right? It's the one that goes rip it, rip it, rip it. I'm sewing a light triangle and a dark triangle together and matching the colors, all of the pink, all of the teals, oranges, greens, and grays to create the rainbow color effect of this design. I'm also chain piecing or assembly line sewing to speed things up. I have my presser foot set to hover on my machine, which means when I stop sewing, the foot will pop up or hover just a little bit while I prepare the next 2 triangles. Then it will go down again when I sew. So I don't have to use my hands to raise and lower the foot every time. I sew a couple of stitches in between each pair of units, and that keeps the continuous chain going. The entire chain piece set looks like a pretty colorful garland. Next, I'll clip all the sewn units apart using a thread cutter. It's super fast and handy to have right next to my machine. Finally, I'll press my seams open so that my blocks will lie nice and flat. This is going to make it so much easier to machine quilt because I won't have any lumps and bumps getting in my way. As you can see, I simply open up the seam with my fingers, then follow along with my hot, dry iron. Contrary to popular myth, this does not weaken your seams, and yes, you can still stitch in the ditch. What I love when using the AccuQuilt die cutter is the accuracy. These half-square triangle units measure precisely 5.5 inches unfinished, and I didn't have to do any additional trimming. Once the blocks are all pressed, they're ready to sew into rows. Be sure to follow the quilt top assembly diagram to lay out your HSTs in the correct color order. I normally use a design wall, but to speed things up for this quilt, I stacked the units on top of each other in order while referring to the diagram constantly to make sure I was making them go the right way. Because these are going to be vertical rows, I have to rotate them to sew the pieces together horizontally, so this kind of keeps me organized so I don't get lost with what I'm doing. I'll stack the blocks in order next to the machine again and start the next round of chain piecing. The pin reminds me which orientation is correct. I'm leaving the pin in the first row so that reminds me where the top of the pieced row is, since they are all going to be hanging vertically. Now I'll turn on some music or listen to a quilty podcast while I relax and enjoy the fabric moving under my machine. It really is a Zen moment for me, and it's almost like meditating. Just keep sewing, just keep sewing. The stiletto helps me keep my accurate 1/4 inch seam all the way through the end of the piece. If I don't use it, I have a tendency to veer off at the corner when I get to the edges, so the stiletto helps me prevent that. Pressing all seams open throughout the quilt will ensure a nice flat quilt top, which makes it easier to baste and later to machine quilt. Once these units have been sewn, I'll lay them out on the design wall in color order to keep things organized. Now it's time to join pairs of units into longer pieces and eventually into the full-size row. Be sure to press each and every seam to keep your blocks crisp and flat. Fortunately, I haven't had to use pins yet and everything is lining up perfectly. This saves time for when I do have to pin in a little while. I'm continuing to chain piece using the stiletto and watching my 1/4 inch seam. Taking care now to ensure my blocks don't stretch out of shape will pay off later when it's time to quilt. And it's back to the design wall again to add each sewn row as it's completed and pressed. Here's how I pin to get perfect joins when my seams are pressed open. First, I'll line up the seam that I'm trying to match. I'll wiggle it into place and add 2 pins to either side of the intersection perpendicularly. I don't pin the middle because I don't want to take a chance that I'll split the seam with the pin. Each time I pin, I'm matching up the seam on each piece and I'm feeling to make sure that the seams aren't overlapping. I'm pinning perpendicular to the seam so that my pins will be easy to remove with my right hand once I'm back at the sewing machine. Taking a little extra time to do this now will save me so much aggravation later. I'll completely pin and sew one row and then repeat this process for each row I'm sewing. Here's how I sew each row once it's been pinned. I'll pull out each pin right before I get to it and continue to chain piece all the rows. That stiletto continues to help me keep the units aligned while sewing. Here's a close-up view where you can see how I get nice, accurate triangle points while I sew. There's a little gray triangle tip that's a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the block. I aim for that as I sew. If it's a little off, that's okay. I can still fudge it if needed. Now I'll get in really close so you can see those nice, crisp triangle points. Pressing seams open after this round of sewing will also help prevent those triangle points from getting sucked into the seams or looking like they've been chopped off. Now each rainbow row is complete and I can join larger sections to complete the quilt top. Here's what it looks like after joining 2 pairs of rows. I use the design wall for each step to make sure I'm not mixing up my rows. This gives me a chance to step back and look at the quilt as it goes together. I'll press each section once it's sewn because it's easier to deal with the bulk that way. Once my quilt top is complete, I'll take a victory lap. Because there are no borders securing these outer edge seams, I'll need to stitch 1/8 inch all the way around the perimeter to keep the seams from splitting open. I can use a larger stitch length for this, so it goes pretty quickly. And there's my finished herringbone quilt top, all ready to baste. This was such a fun quilt top to make. You can get a link to download the free pattern so that you can make one too. I'm going to show you how to prep the quilt for basting, how to machine quilt a really interesting custom quilting design, and how to finish the quilt with binding. Now in the video tutorial, I'm showing how to bind it by hand, but you can also bind it by machine. I have lots of tutorials showing how to do that as well. I like to take a picture of the batting I'm using so that I can keep track for each quilt. For this quilt, I'm using Hobbs Tuscany bleached cotton, and I can unroll it across the quilt to measure how much I'll need. I decided to use all of the thread colors to match my Stitchy fabrics used in this quilt. These are 100% cotton, which is my favorite for both piecing and quilting. They are all for my Piece and Quilt Colors collections from Aurifil. I also have a neutral thread collection, and I'll be using one of those to quilt all of the background fabric. Now I will spray baste my quilt outside. I put down a large towel to protect the table I'm using. First, I will spray the back side of the quilt top using 505 adhesive spray outside. I smooth it all out to make sure there's no wrinkles in the quilt top. I'll shake the can and make sure the spray comes out smoothly and the nozzle isn't clogged. Then I'll spray a light, even amount across the wrong side of the entire quilt top. It's nice that my quilt is in rows so that I can do this methodically. I'll make sure to cover the entire top and the sides of the quilt that hang off the table. If you are worried about the overspray, you can always put a drop cloth on the ground to protect it. Once the top is done, I'll fold it up wrong side out so the front side doesn't get sticky, and I'll set it aside. It's a little tacky to the touch, but it's not stuck together like glue or anything, and it's easy enough to unfold when I get to the next step. Now I'll repeat the process with the quilt backing. I'll spread it out wrong side up on the table and apply a light amount of spray. I can usually get several quilts out of one can of basting spray, depending on how big it is. You can see my seam in the middle of the quilt back. It doesn't really matter which way the seam goes, as long as the back is about 4 to 6 inches larger than the quilt top all the way around. I'll make sure I have good coverage on the backing and lift up the edge of the fabric to make sure it's all coated in basting spray. Then I'll fold it up wrong side out and bring both layers inside to finish basting it on my design wall. Be sure to check out the link in the description box for a tutorial on how I built my design wall using a couple of foam core boards and a flannel sheet. It's a must-have tool in my sewing room. I attach the backing at the top, sticky side out. I can pin the top so that it won't fall down. I'm using a ladder because I'm very short, but I'll smooth out the backing using my hands and a long acrylic ruler. It kind of acts as an extra arm extension so I can smooth out the entire surface. Next, I'll add the batting that I've cut to be larger than the quilt top, but somewhat smaller than the backing. I'm not trying to line things up perfectly. The extra fabric and batting give me some wiggle room so I don't have to be so precise. Again, I'll smooth out the batting with my arms and the long ruler. The ruler will get a little bit sticky with repeated use, so you can wash it in warm soapy water if you need to, and I have a separate ruler that I use just for basting. Add the quilt top the same way. Start at the top so that gravity can pull the weight of the quilt and get rid of any folds or wrinkles. The nice thing about using a design wall is getting up super close to the quilt to smooth out any lumps or bumps. This is where pressing seams open comes into play so that my quilt top is nice and flat and smooth. The extra batting and backing will get trimmed away, and I can cut those up into smaller chunks to use as practice scraps for machine quilting later on. I'll keep using the ruler to smooth everything into place. Once the quilt top is all smoothed out, I'll use my batting shears to trim up the sides of the quilt. These specialty scissors cut through the thick layers like butter. They even have my Christa Quilts logo etched into them. So if you use them on your quilts, it's kind of like me spreading a little magic pixie dust all around. I'll trim the edges so that there's only about 1 to 2 inches sticking out beyond the quilt top. This is so that the quilt edges don't flip underneath while you're quilting and making you accidentally quilt through multiple layers. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done that. Now here's the last magical step of my basting process. I iron both sides of the quilt to set the glue. I'll start on the back side first, and I'm using what's called a big board that sits right on top of my ironing board to give me more work surface. I'm ironing out any wrinkles and sort of meshing all the fibers together. Then I'll flip the quilt over and repeat on the front side. Again, I'm ensuring that my blocks and rows stay straight as I press. The wonderful thing about basting spray and ironing the quilt is that every inch of the quilt is going to be stuck to itself, so there's no shifting while machine quilting. However, you can still peel the layers apart if for some reason you need to reposition it. But by doing this method, you don't have to add any pins to your quilt, and the best part is you don't have to stop and remove any pins while quilting. That saves so much time. Once the basted quilt is smooth and flat, it's ready to machine quilt. So the first thing I need to do in quilting is to make a quilting plan. Here's my rough sketch. I'll stitch in the ditch first to anchor or secure the quilt for additional quilting later. I'll start on the right-hand side of my quilt because it's easier to control the bulk that way. I'm going to stitch in the ditch between each of the rows from the top of the quilt to the bottom, cutting thread after I complete each line of quilting. Once I reach the center of the quilt, I'll rotate it 180 degrees and continue quilting from the center of the quilt back to where I left off on the other side. So my ditching order is right side of the quilt moving towards the center, and then from the center of the quilt back to the right side again. After the vertical seams have all been ditched, then I'll rotate the quilt again so that I can quilt all of the horizontal seams that form that zigzag or herringbone design. From my perspective, I'm always stitching each ditch line from the top of the quilt to the bottom. I like to design quilts and machine quilting plans that allow me to quilt the longest continuous line that I can without stopping. So again, I'll work my way methodically across the quilt, starting on the right-hand side and working my way towards the center, one quilted line at a time. Once you reach the center again, rotate the quilt 180 degrees and continue quilting where you left off. It's actually much easier to start quilting on the edge of your quilt rather than in the middle. If you start in the center, you have too much bulk to deal with and it feels very stressful. However, by easing your way across the quilt in the methodical manner, it gets you more comfortable with the process one row at a time. You can gently add more bulk underneath the machine as you quilt each row. Now I'll show you what this actually looks like while quilting my herringbone quilt. So here I'm quilting the vertical ditch lines first, just like I planned. I'm wearing quilting gloves to help grip the quilt and make it easier to slide underneath the machine. I'm stitching with my neutral colored thread, and I'm using my Bernina's dual feed system, which performs the same function as a walking foot, so I use those terms interchangeably. Here's a close-up shot of me stitching in the ditch, following the horizontal zigzags across the quilt. I'm using an open toe foot for better visibility. On my Bernina, I'm using the 20D foot with the dual feed engaged. If you're using a walking foot, choose one with an open toe so you can see what you're doing. Notice how much I stop and reposition my hands while stitching. I want to keep the area in between my hands nice and flat to ensure smooth stitching. I'll stop with the needle in the down position so I can quickly and easily rotate the quilt as I stitch each side of the herringbone block. Each time I move the quilt, I smooth down the area I'm stitching before I start again. I actually spend more time adjusting the quilt than I spend quilting, but that's all part of the process, so I just enjoy it and allow myself plenty of time to get it done. My seams have been pressed open and I'm having no issues stitching smoothly in the ditch. As I work my way across the quilt, I'll rotate the quilt to follow the outline of each block, and I'll continue to smooth out the area underneath in between my hands. Think of the area I'm quilting as the valley, and the scrunched up areas around it are the hills. For walking foot quilting, I've set my stitch length to 3.0, which is longer than what the default is and longer than what I use for piecing, which is 2.0. This helps accommodate for any friction or drag on the quilt, which tends to shrink up your stitches. I also have my presser foot pressure turned all the way down to 0. This is a newer feature on some of the nicer machines, which really helps the foot glide smoothly over the quilt rather than sinking down into it. Reducing the presser foot pressure together with seams pressed open virtually eliminates any chance that I'll get puckers in my quilt, especially when crossing over previously stitched lines. Here's a wide shot of what it looks like while I'm quilting at the machine using my Christa cabinet to hold up the weight and bulk of the quilt. I designed this table in collaboration with Arrow Sewing with an L-shaped design that gives enough room off to my left to hold up the weight of the quilt so it doesn't fall onto the floor or into my lap while quilting. I introduced the Christa cabinet at a trade show with Arrow in the spring of 2022, and it's been very well received. The extra guardrails around the edges are called Christa's quilt blocks, and they block the quilt from falling off the edges while sewing. This has been such a game changer for me, especially when quilting larger quilts. And the best part is, the quilt blocks are offered separately in pairs and will fit on any sewing table that's less than 3/4 of an inch thick. Be sure to check out the description box of this video for more details about my cabinet, including the exact dimensions. My simplified quilting plan calls for stippling in the background and continuous curves in the triangles. After testing this design, I decided I want to quilt it more densely, so here's how I did that. First, I quilted continuous curves inside the triangle shapes. I'm stitching a smooth curve from point to point at the tip of each triangle. Watch me make my way around the block. I'm not finishing the design in each block yet because I need to leave myself a pathway to get around the quilt without stopping. So I'll quilt partial curves all the way down each row for now. You can trace the pathway using the quilting plan provided in the free pattern, or you can create your own quilting plan or find a pathway that makes sense to you. The important part is to draw it out on paper ahead of time so you have a bit of a game plan before you dive in and quilt the real quilt. Here's another myth I want to bust. Open seams stitched in the ditch will not weaken my quilt because the bed of the machine is stabilizing the quilt underneath while I stitch. In fact, I'm actually strengthening the quilt with each line of quilting that I add. And the natural fiber batting that I'm using clings to my quilt top to prevent shifting. The ditch work is stabilizing the quilt so that I can add the free motion quilting next. Not having to remove the pins while quilting saves me a ton of time and aggravation. I've been spray basting now for about 7 or 8 years, and I will never go back to pins. So all of these things I'm showing you work together to make machine quilting easier and more enjoyable. But just remember, if you have techniques or certain ways you like to do things, it's perfectly fine to keep on doing that. Once I reach the bottom of each row, I'll quilt back up the unquilted side to finish the continuous curves in each block. I actually decided to quilt a double curve in each block by echoing the previous line. Then I added pebbles in the open space in each triangle to give the design more texture. Whenever I come up with a quilting plan, it's totally okay to deviate for it or add in more details as I get to it. Pebbles or any other dense quilting design is great for traveling around your quilt because you can always backtrack or stitch on top of a previous line of quilting to get to the next spot you want to quilt without needing to cut thread and start all over. I'll stitch this design one colorful row at a time just for added fun. I wanted to switch thread colors in each row to match the saturated fabrics, so I wanted to be able to quilt the entire row of colorful triangles in one pass. A lot of time, the thread colors and the pathway I take around the quilt is going to help determine my quilting plan. I'll do the stippling in the lighter background fabric in a separate pass of quilting with a neutral colored thread, but that will also be continuous. Here's another close-up showing how I began stitching the next row with the continuous curves. I'm free motion quilting, which means my feed dogs are dropped, and I'm using a specialty free motion quilting foot to fit my machine. If you have a stitch regulator, that can help you quilt nice even stitches, but I learned to quilt without one, so it's what I'm used to. I just use the open toe 24 foot on my Bernina. When you are regulating the stitches yourself, you want to aim for a smooth, fluid movement while you stitch and not get too hung up on perfection. One of the reasons I quilt my quilt so densely is to hide my imperfections. Here's an overhead shot so you can really see what it looks like from my perspective at the machine. I'm just focusing on one small area at a time, and my hands act like sort of a hoop to keep everything smooth and flat as I stitch. Just remember, there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's what feels most comfortable to you. Because the fabrics are so bright and busy on this quilt, it's a really great design to practice your machine quilting. Sketching out your design with a pen and piece of scratch paper will help you get a feel for the flow of the design, so I highly recommend doodling before you quilt. I don't mark any of the design on the actual quilt at all. Instead, I just sketch it out on paper to kind of get an idea, and then when it comes to the quilt, I stitch organically and let the design flow however it wants to end up. Here's a close-up showing how I stitch the pebbles inside a triangle. Let them be as organic as you like. None of them are the same size, and that's perfectly fine. The last part of my quilting plan is stippling in the background with a neutral thread. I'm zooming in so you can better see what I'm doing. I don't like my stitching to stand out, so I like for my thread colors to blend in rather be the star of the show. So even when I'm doing my videos, I'm not going to use a contrasting thread because I want you to see what it actually looks like when I'm quilting a real quilt. I'm just stitching wiggles and bumps to fill in the entire area, and I do all of the stippling in one neutral colored thread so I can quilt continuously from edge to edge in all the background areas. Notice how I move over into the next section by stitching through the intersections where the same fabrics touch. If you can trace an unbroken line across all of the same fabric, you can quilt continuously without stopping and starting again. I'll start quilting in the batting on one edge of the quilt and work my way across the row until I reach the batting on the other side. Then I'll stitch off the edge of the quilt on that side so I don't have to tie off my threads. That will all get trimmed away later. And just remember, the best way to hide imperfect quilting is to surround it with more imperfect quilting. Now the last thing I want to show you is how to bind the quilt. First, I trim the quilt so the edges are flush. I'm using a fresh, sharp blade in my rotary cutter. I'll trim all the corners first with the largest square ruler that I can find. Then I'll use a long acrylic ruler for the sides to keep things nice and straight and even. Since I recorded this video, I actually released a brand new ergonomic rotary cutter that is such a game changer, so make sure you check that out. When sewing scrappy binding strips, I prefer to sew straight seams instead of diagonal ones to make my continuous binding. This will save fabric because there are so many seams, and it will prevent shadowing from occurring, which can happen when sewing a light and dark binding strip together. I'll chain piece all of the shorter binding strips and press my seams open. Starting away from the corner, I'll leave a few inches of starting tail that I'll join together at the end when I'm ready to finish. My binding strips are cut 2 inches wide, and I'm using the 1/4 inch dual feed foot on my machine to attach it with 1/4 inch seams. The narrow binding will end up the same size on both the front and back. When I'm almost to the end of the first corner, I'll make a crease in the binding showing me where the end of the quilt is. Then I'll stop stitching a 1/4 inch in front of the crease and sew off the edge of the quilt. Next, I'll do what I call the funky fold to make the corner miters. I'll bring the binding strip up so that it's in a straight line with the right edge of the quilt, and I'll finger press the diagonal. Then I'll fold it back down on itself and ensure that the top of the fold lines up perfectly with the top of the quilt. Then I'll give a little tug on my starting threads to help pull the bulky corner into the machine to stitch the next side. I'll repeat this process for all 4 corners and sides of the quilt. Here's a bonus tip. If you end up getting a seam in the corner, just cut off a little bit of the binding strip at that point and re-sew it to move the seam out of the way of the corner. Leave some ending tail unsewn so you can join the edges. Mark a straight line where the starting tail lines up inside of the ending tail. Add 1/2 inch for seam allowances and trim the excess using a mini mat and ruler right at your machine. Pin the ends and sew 1/4 inch seam to complete the binding. Press this seam open to reduce bulk. Pin it back in place and finish sewing the binding to the front of the quilt. Flip the binding over to the back of the quilt and pin or secure it in place with binding clips. Fold the corners so they are going in opposite directions from the corner fold on the front. I like to hand stitch my bindings whenever I have enough time, but you can do it by machine as well. For hand stitching, I'll make a knot by wrapping the thread around the needle 3 times and pulling it through. I wear a thimble on my right middle finger to help me push the needle through the fabric, and I stitch from right to left with the quilt facing away from me. I take one stitch at a time, grabbing a little bit of the backing and right at the folded edge of the binding each time. It takes a little longer to do it this way, but I love to cuddle up with the quilt while I do this, so it's quite relaxing for me. This is pretty much the only handwork I do, so I'm going to enjoy it. However, if you'd prefer to machine bind, be sure to check out my other video tutorials showing how to do that. I'll put a link for you in the description box. Remember, you are the boss of your quilt, so you can do whatever techniques you prefer. Well, I sure hope you'll enjoy making this quilt as much as I did. I really like to empower you guys to be able to make the quilt from start to finish with cutting, piecing, basting, quilting, and binding every single step. If you do make this quilt, I would love to know. Please leave me a comment and let me know how it turned out. If you want to share pictures, that would be amazing too. And you can always ask me questions because I'm here to guide you every step of the way. Until next time, happy quilting.